What's up, party people? Uh, this is a piece that I found on the internet. I don't know if I haven't really done any research on it. I just like the title. Um, is of toward a critical history of methodological individualism by a Fritz Efaw. I'm assuming that's his name, or Efaw. Let's see who this character is. Don't see anything, but anyway. Let's read on. Probably the most pervasive and best-known stories in the mythology of economics involve the law of unintended consequences, the paradigmatic example of which is Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees. Wikipedia says, The Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Benefits, published in 1714, is a book by the Anglo-Dutch social philosopher Bernard Mandeville. It consists of the satirical poem The Grumbling Hive, or Knaves Turned Honest, which was first published anonymously in 1705, a prose discussion of the poem called Remarks, and an essay, An Inquiry into the Origin of Moral Virtue. In 1723, a second edition was published with 2 essays. In The Grumbling Hive, Mandeville describes a bee community that thrives until the bees decide to live by honesty and virtue. As they abandon their desire for personal gain, the economy of their hive collapses, and they go on to live simple, quote, virtuous lives in a hollow tree. Mandeville's implication that private vices create social benefits caused a scandal when public attention turned to the work, especially after its 1723 edition. Mandeville's social theory and the thesis of the book, according to E.J. Hundert, is that, quote, contemporary society is an aggregation of self-interested individuals necessarily bound to one another neither by their shared civic commitments nor their moral rectitude, but paradoxically by the tenuous bonds of envy, competition, and exploitation, end quote. E.G. Hundert. Mandeville implied that people were hypocrites for espousing rigorous ideas about virtue and vice, while they failed to act according to those beliefs in their private lives. Mandeville observed that those preaching against vice had no qualms about benefiting from vice in the form of their society's overall wealth, which Mandeville saw as the cumulative result of individual vices, such as luxury, gambling, and crime, which benefited lawyers and the justice system. Mandeville's challenge to the popular idea of virtue, in which only unselfish Christian behavior was virtuous, caused a controversy that lasted through the 18th century and influenced thinkers in moral philosophy and economics. In recent years, philosophers have imported the idea of Mandevillian virtue and vice from ethics to epistemology, arguing that what might seem like intellectual vices in individuals sometimes contribute to group inquiry. The Fable of the Bees influenced ideas about the division of labor and the free market, laissez-faire, and the philosophy of utilitarianism was advanced as Mandeville's critics, in defending their views of virtue, also altered them. Mandeville's work influenced Scottish Enlightenment thinkers like Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, and Adam Smith. End of Wikipedia intro. Back to the text. This law is summed up in the dictum that selfish private motives, e.g., profit maximization, may have good social consequences, and noble political intentions, e.g., socialism, may have bad social consequences. Later in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the law is personified or deified in the metaphor of the invisible hand. The ontological position that underlies this metaphor is social atomism, the notion that society is reducible to and has no existence apart from the individuals that make society up. The methodological stance generated by this position is methodological individualism, the view in economics and in the social sciences generally that complex social phenomena can be understood as the outcome of the behavior of individual agents or actors. This is the stance taken by the currently dominant school of neoclassical economics, although it extends beyond the neoclassical realm to Keynesian and post-Keynesian economics, for example. J.W.N. Watkins defines methodological individualism as the principle, quote, that social processes and events should be explained by being deduced from A, principles governing the behavior of participating individuals, and B, descriptions of their situations, end quote. J.W.N. Watkins. Wikipedia says, John William Neville Watkins was an English philosopher, a professor at the London School of Economics, and from 1966 until his retirement in 1989, a prominent proponent of critical rationalism. And the Wikipedia for critical rationalism says, critical rationalism is an epistemological philosophy advanced by Karl Popper on the basis that if a statement cannot be logically deduced from what is known, it might nevertheless be possible to logically falsify it. Following Hume, Popper rejected any inductive logic that is ampliative, i.e. any logic that can provide more knowledge than deductive logic. This led Popper to his falsifiability criterion. Popper wrote about critical rationalism in many works, including The Logic of Scientific Discovery, 1934, The Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945, Conjectures and Refutations, 1963, Unended Quest, 1976, and The Myth of the Framework, 1994. Back to the text. Individualism is contrasted by its proponents with collectivism or holism. Watkins describes two problematic areas for methodological individualism: explanations involving statistical irregularities and instances of certain group behavior that effectively reveal its conceptual weaknesses. For if statistical explanations are admissible, the elements of social theory must meet the strict mathematical requirements of probability theory. And the examples Watkins and other methodological individualists give of true, quote, holistic or, quote, collectivist behavior, parenthesis, quote, jive sessions and revivalist meetings, end quote, and parenthesis, demonstrate that what they have in mind is the behavior of individuals in groups. I'm going to repeat that sentence because there's italics in it. And the examples Watkins and other methodological individualists give of true, quote, holistic or, quote, collectivist behavior, quote, jive sessions and revivalist meetings, end quote, demonstrate what they have in mind is the behavior of individuals in groups. John W.N. Watkins is quite candid about this. Quote, the methodological individualist, end quote, John W.N. Watkins says, quote, will try to explain the large-scale effect as the indirect. Will try to explain the large-scale effect as the indirect, unexpected complex product of individual factors, none of which singly may bear any resemblance to it at all. To use hackneyed examples, he may show that a longing for peace led, in a certain international situation, to war, or that a government's desire to improve a bad economic situation by balancing the budget only worsened the situation. Since Mandeville's Fable of the Bees was published in 1714, individualist social sciences, with its emphasis on unintended consequences, has largely been a sophisticated elaboration on the simple theme that, in certain situations, selfish private motives may have good social consequences and good political intentions bad social consequences. End quote. John W. N. Watkins, 1973. The attraction of methodological individualism for neoclassical economics is that if methodological individualism were valid, social events could be deduced from principles governing the behavior of individuals. All that would then remain would be to find a solution to a generalized aggregation problem. One second. So I just wanted to look this up before I continue. I'll finish the sentence. I should finish the sentence first, right? All that would then remain would be to find a solution to a generalized aggregation problem, which is what neoclassical economics attempts to do by posing the solution as the outcome of a maximum problem. A maximization problem. A maximization problem. Neoclassical economics does this, moreover, with the moral of Fable of the Bees precisely in mind. And the Wikipedia for an aggregation problem says, in economics, an aggregate is a summary measure. An aggregate replaces a vector that is composed of many real numbers by a single real number or a scalar. Consequently, there occur various problems that are inherent in the formulations that use aggregated variables. The aggregation problem is the problem of finding a valid way to treat an empirical or theoretical aggregate as if it reacted like a less aggregated measure, say about the behavior of an individual agent as described in general microeconomic theory. See representative agent and heterogeneity in economics. The second meaning of, quote, aggregation problem is the theoretical difficulty in using and treating laws and theorems that include aggregate variables. A typical example is the aggregate production function. Another famous problem is Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem. Most of macroeconomic statements comprise this problem. Disaggregation is the decomposition of an aggregate to variables closer to empirical data. Examples of aggregates in micro and macroeconomics relative to disaggregated counterparts are aggregate variable, food basket, disaggregated components, apples, coffee. Aggregate variable, price level of basket. Disaggregated components, price level of apples, coffee. Price level of coffee. Aggregate variable, price level of apples. Disaggregated components, price level of green apples, red apples. Aggregate variable, gross output of a nation. Disaggregated components. Total sale of nation's apples, steel coils. Aggregate variable, a firm's capital stock. Disaggregated components. Value of a firm's buildings, the value of a firm's steam shovels. Aggregate variable, money supply. Disaggregated components. Savings deposits. Vault cash, paper money. Aggregate variable, general unemployment rate. Disaggregated components, the unemployment rate of civil engineers' waiting staff. Standard theory uses simple assumptions to derive general and commonly accepted results as the law of demand to explain market behavior. An example is the abstraction of a composite good. It considers the price of one good changing proportionally to the composite good, that is, all other goods. If this assumption is violated, and the agents are subjected to aggregated utility functions, Restrictions on the latter are necessary to yield the law of demand. The aggregation problem emphasizes how broad such restrictions are in microeconomics, use of broad factor inputs, quote, labor and, quote, capital, real, quote, output and, quote, investment, as if there was only a single such aggregate, is without a solid foundation for rigorously deriving analytical results. Franklin Fisher notes that this has not dissuaded macroeconomists from continuing to use such concepts. End of Wikipedia intro. Back to the text. But social science is not concerned with large-scale group behavior, conceived as the behavior of large numbers of individuals. Instead, social science is concerned with persistent relations between individuals, between husbands and wives, students and teachers, representatives and constituents, etc. These do not involve the kind of behavior that Watkins describes. The problem that arises is not so much how to give an individualistic explanation of social behavior, but how to give a non-social explanation of individual behavior. Relations play no part in maximization models. Maximization models explain not what individuals do, but how individuals do it. The plausibility of methodological individualism derives from the truism that society is made up of individuals. The attempt to build a theory of society on the basis of this observation, however, is analogous to an attempt to build a meteorology on the fact that the atmosphere is made up of gas molecules. It is true, but to theorize about and study the behavior of molecules in the hope of predicting the path of hurricanes and other storm systems is generally recognized to be futile. To understand the origins of the notion of individualistic explanation requires acquiring the perspective of a historical period when the standard model for what we now call social science, and much other science besides, was very different. Specifically, during the early Renaissance, before Copernicus and before Galileo, society, nature, and most other aspects of the universe were understood in the hierarchical terms taken from Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. The basic scientific paradigm was not that of atoms, but of an organism. Spiritual reality was conceived as a hierarchy of God, archangels, angels, etc. This corresponds to a social/political hierarchy of kings, noblemen, peasants, etc. Taking the analogy further, the body was understood in terms of the hierarchy of heart, mind, arms. These distinct entities were viewed as working together in a harmony to promote the well-being of something, the state, the community, health, God's creation. The physical world was also understood in different terms. Objects moved to their natural place, fire above, earth below, and followed a natural motion, circular in the heavens, linear on earth. Although God was thought to be immanent in nature, the notion of force at a distance, e.g. gravity, was seen as ludicrous or at best occult. The dissolution of the Renaissance worldview is often presented in terms of the challenge to Aristotelian science initiated by Galileo and completed by Newton. Nature was mathematized, with homogeneous abstract space replacing the differentiated place continuum of pre-Galilean physics and astronomy. The search by scientists like Paracelsus for ways to develop noble metals from base metals was abandoned. The pre-Socratic atomist doctrines of Democritus and Lucretius were revived. The impact of a change of worldview does not stop there, however. Linkages between the physical world and the social and spiritual worlds mean that a breakdown of order in one sphere calls into question the concepts on which order in others is based. Our concern here is to examine the impact of the dissolution of the Renaissance world on thinking about moral, or what came to be called social issues, in the 17th and 18th centuries. The late 16th and early 17th centuries were times of political and religious turmoil. In England, this took the form of regicide, revolution, and counter-revolution. In Germany, religious wars decimated populations. And in France, it was a period of shifting alliances between the nobility, the bourgeoisie, and an increasingly centralized monarchy under Louis XIV. The only area of human endeavor that could be characterized by increasing stability was natural science, where the development of the Newtonian system seemed to provide a unified framework for understanding a broad range of phenomena, from planetary motion to the tides. In short, the success of Newtonian physics made it inevitable that many of Newtonian physics' features came to be viewed as essential for any kind of science, so that the newly emerging science of man and society tried to conform to its pattern. Additionally, the worldview developed by the new sciences held open a place for religious belief, for the forces of attraction that bound Newton's universe together required the metaphysical force of God's will, acting according to the mathematical stricture of natural law. To maintain the connection between modern science and religious beliefs, the image of God gradually metamorphosed from that of a king on a throne to that of a clockmaker, who set the world in perpetual motion in accordance with mathematical laws. By the time of Laplace, in the early 19th century, even God became an unnecessary hypothesis for the modern scientific worldview. But 100 years earlier, the image of God as author of a mechanical clockwork universe provided a basis for optimism. For if order and harmony were the rule in nature, then why were they absent in the social order? Clearly because their absence was man-made, the result of man's stupidity and ignorance in attempting to tamper with and replace natural law. Man stood apart from and in opposition to nature. The remedy, it was concluded, was to discover and live according to that law. Generally speaking, two lines of thought developed out of the enthusiasm for modern science. One, led by thinkers like Vico and Montesquieu, followed the empiricist tendency in modern scientific thought, looking for law-like regularities in the varieties of known historical and contemporary societies. The other, following the track of rationalism at the core of modern science, set out to derive laws of social behavior from the formal model of atomistic individuals. Social atomism grew directly from this. Classical economics undertook a search for the essential features of human nature that would correspond to the essential features of matter allegedly discovered by Newton. Several early thinkers in this area were influenced by advances in medicine. Hobbes begins his analysis of humans with a reminder that living organisms are distinguished by the existence of an internal, quote, vital motion, a recent discovery of William Harvey. I think William Harvey was like a blood guy. He was like one of the people who first came up with the notion of like circulation. The model of the state as an organism represents something of a throwback to Renaissance science, but the self-regulation of the system based on analogy with homeostasis is thoroughly modern. François Quesnay in France and John Locke and William Petty in England were all trained medical practitioners. For the latter, the policy of laissez-faire was advocated for the statesman as a method to encourage natural processes and remove abnormal conditions, just as the work of the physician was to encourage natural healing processes and remove pathological conditions. The biological model these early thinkers pursued was subsequently discarded in favor of a model patterned on Newtonian physics. Adam Smith was particularly thorough in developing an economic theory patterned on the method of Newton, analyzing the economic system analyzing the economic system into atoms of individuals acting in accordance with principles, e.g., to quote, truck, barter, and exchange, end quote, with which they are endowed. The inertial self-interest of individuals is checked by the gravitational interaction of the market, leading to natural equilibrium prices. Smith searched for the simplicity of the Newtonian system in moral philosophy. Speaking of social systems, Smith says, quote, systems in many respects resemble machines. A machine in a little system created to perform, as well as to connect together in reality those different movements and effects which the artist has occasion for. A philosophical system is an imaginary machine invented to connect together in the fancy those different movements and effects which are already in reality performed, end quote. Smith, 1795. I guess that's The Wealth of Nations. Smith then goes on to say that just as machines are complex when first invented, but later evolved to simpler designs, philosophical systems too are complex at first. Quote, but it often happens that one great connecting principle is afterwards found to be sufficient to bind together all the discordant phenomena that occur as a whole species of things, end quote. Smith. None of the foregoing discussion should be taken to imply that changes in scientific thought alone cause changes in social thought. Causality may equally be understood as operating in the opposite direction. The historian David Bloor has suggested that Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, and other members of the Royal Society selected schemes for classification and analogy in the natural sciences, including models of physical universe composed of inanimate atomic particles that would be aligned with their personal desires for social stability in the aftermath of the English Revolution of the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Wikipedia says David Bloor is a British sociologist. He is a professor in and former director of the Science Studies Unit at the University of Edinburgh. David Bloor is a key figure in the Edinburgh School and played a major role in the development of the field of science and technology studies. He is best known for advocating the Strong program in the sociology of scientific knowledge, most notably in his book, Knowledge and Social Imagery. Back to the text. David Bloor cites this episode as an instance of one of the central propositions of the sociology of knowledge formulated by Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss in 1903 to the effect that the classification of things reproduces the classification of men. In the view of Durkheim and Mauss, human beings lack the capacity to construct complex systems of classification, which, after all, are not found in nature but are cultural artifacts. If the model for such classification is not to be found in nature, then Durkheim and Mauss conclude the model must be society itself. Quote, far from it being the case, end quote, Durkheim and Mauss say, quote, that the social relations of men are based on logical relations between things, in reality, it is the social relations of men which have provided the prototype for the logical relations between things. ... The first logical categories were social categories. The first classes of things were classes of men, into which these things were integrated. ... Logical hierarchy is only another aspect of social hierarchy, and the unity of knowledge is nothing else than the very unity of the collectivity extended to the universe. End quote. Durkheim and Mauss, 1903. Following Smith, other classical economists attempted to discover universal, quote, iron laws of economics, end quote, to use Marx's phrase, and to build a theory of economic systems on the basis of natural law. This undertaking involved further development of the idea of a dichotomy between man and nature, subject and object, self and other. In this framework, nature is viewed as something external and given that both determine and limit action in the human or social sphere. Nature gives up her fruits in a niggardly fashion and must be dominated and overcome. David Ricardo was the classical economist who went furthest in developing a theory which our grounds our understanding of the economy in nature. And, that's one of the problems with, I'm not sure, actually, I shouldn't say that. It seems like that if that's true, that would definitely be a problem for Ricardian influenced Marxism. But carrying on. In the preface to his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, Ricardo clearly states that by taking distribution of, quote, the produce of the earth, all that is derived from its surface, by the united application of labor, machinery, and capital, end quote, as his starting point, Ricardo intends to improve on the writings of, quote, Turgot, Smith, Say, Sismondi, and others, who afford very little satisfactory information respecting the natural course of rent, profit, and wages. End quote. Ricardo. Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. In order to ground the economy solidly in nature, Ricardo revised Smith's labor theory of value to produce a theory in which labor is a natural substance, whose existence does not necessitate exchange. A problem this gives rise to is that exchange value cannot be explained independently. That's very important. That's exactly what I was talking about. I don't know what this author's positions are, but that's kind of like, right, the critique of like Ricardian forms of Marxism don't make very little of like the necessity of value, for instance, being expressed in a thing, whether that be that the necessity of money and the socially specific character of value, right? Heinrich, for instance, calls this like a substantialist theory of value, as opposed to Marx's purely social theory of value. And so, this is very interesting to me. In order to ground the economy solidly in nature, Ricardo revised Smith's labor theory of value to produce a theory in which labor is a natural substance whose existence does not necessitate exchange. A problem this gives rise to is that exchange value cannot be explained independently. Ricardo's search for a, quote, invariable measure of value, and that's another thing, right? In Marxism, value is not invariable. Ricardo's search for a, quote, invariable measure of value, end quote, to solve this problem may be understood as analogous to the requirement in the Newtonian system for absolute space as the framework for inertial motion. The rationalist tendency in post-Enlightenment social theory reaches an apex in neoclassical economics, which stands in need of methodological individualism above all. For in shifting the scope of economic science from the distribution of production to the allocation of resources through market exchange, individuals are conceived of as the source of subjective value, rather than the creators of intrinsic objective value. Right, and if you're, just as a side note for myself, and Marx's would be neither of these, right? Marx's concept of value is not subjective, but neither is it intrinsic to any given commodity itself, right? It's a value is a strictly social substance, but it's socially objective, right? It's a real abstraction, not just a or it's a product. It's a real entity. Value is real, but it's not a materially real thing. It's not some kind of mystical attribute of products of labor as such. It's a specific format of products of labor, commodities that have value. It's not things themselves. So, sorry for my interruption. For in shifting the scope of economic science from the distribution of production to the allocation of resources through market exchange, individuals are conceived of as the source of subjective value rather than the creators of intrinsic objective value. Sorry, there's a side note here. I'm going to probably read the sentence 3 times because I keep having ideas. This is there's a piece by Patrick Murray that's about Samuel Bailey. And I think Samuel Bailey kind of had it was kind of like a proto-neoclassical economist, right? Who was like a critic of Ricardian economics, I think in in Marx's period, right? So the mid-19th century. He basically said that there is no fundamental intrinsic core to value. And there's just prices which are mediated by supply and demand. So for instance, so that would take the notion that commodities have the determination of commodity exchanges is labor content off the table, right? And the paper that Patrick Murray wrote is about how Bailey's argument and Marx's I think it's about, and the interactions of Marx with Samuel Bailey helped Marx to become a critic of political economy as opposed to a political economist, right? Because in classical political economy, especially if you're thinking about Ricardo, as we just discussed, value is value. Labor is the intrinsic invariable measure of value, right? And in Marx, if you follow, especially the more sophisticated readings of the opening chapters, Marx does not have that intrinsic view of value. Obviously, people will say, and I think rightly say, I think Heinrich is right to say that there is ambiguities, because in certain places he'll say it's a purely social substance. On the other hand, it'd be it's an expenditure of brain, nerves, and muscles, and these things are incompatible. And when Marx is kind of giving this material definition of the abstract labor that constitutes value, he's saying bullshit. There's incompatibility. There's ambivalences in Marx's writings, or ambiguities, and the correct interpretation of Marxian theory would necessitate viewing value as purely social, which I think is also more consistently documented, especially if you look at, for instance, the work from the critique of a contribution to the critique of political economy from 1859. So, yeah. That's all I'm saying is that there's a degree to which Marx gets lumped in very much so with classical economics, And what the article by Patrick Murray says is that like this kind of like it's sort of like engagement with the thought of this kind of like proto neoclassical economist helped Marx to more fundamentally understand, like, you know, he would say that, value is objective, but it's socially objective, not naturally or materially or physically objective in the products of labor. So people like Heinrich and stuff think that like one of the things like that would disagree with narratives that say that the development of neoclassical economics was a purely like political maneuver, kind of used because to a lot of Marxists will say is like neoclassical theory had the purpose and the effect of removing exploitation, the concept of exploitation, and the concept of labor producing value from the equation, for producing all new value from the equation, which is true. It certainly did have that effect, and most of the economists, the early marginal utility people, were conservative in terms of did support like laissez-faire, right? But Heinrich and other people, and I think rightly so, thought that there was serious theoretical problems with the classical theory of value based on labor as represented in Ricardo, which tried to give like I just said like was just said in the piece, like a invariable measure of value represented by or not represented, and that measure being labor. That's why Marx makes such a big stink about abstract labor, because it's not like labor as such that determines value, but a very specific social type of labor, valorizing labor, which is not measurable in any particular concrete labor process. That would be not be abstract labor, but concrete labor you're measuring. So I'm probably fucking up your reading experience of this essay, or listening experience of this essay, by giving my own kind of marginalia on the topic. But this is directly related to like the value form analysis. So and the critique of Ricardian Marxism, which is so central to value form analysis, just like popping right into your face here. So let me restart this paragraph. The rationalist tendency in post-Enlightenment social theory reaches an apex in neoclassical economics, which stands in need of methodological individualism above all. For in shifting the scope of economic science from the distribution of production to the allocation of resources through market exchange, individuals are conceived as the source of subjective value rather than the creators of intrinsic objective value. And again, for myself, Marx accepts neither of those. Nature still limits human action through scarcity, but now it is the individual rather than nature that is exogenous and hence indeterminate in his or her social existence. As William Milberg puts it, quote, social action in the Walrasian framework is the individual pursuit of the subjectively given end, that is, to freely exchange social wealth in a perfectly competitive market in order to satisfy consumption desires. And that's referring to, I think it's Leo Walras, important neoclassical economist. Optimal satisfaction of these desires, freedom, is thus equivalent to the rational pursuit of this goal, utility maximization. Reason and freedom are linked, and society represents at once the arena for the attainment of freedom and the cause of freedom's elusiveness. End quote. William Milberg. It says William Milberg. It teaches at the New School for Social Research. Blah, blah, blah. William Milberg is professor of economics at the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lang College and director of the Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School. William Milberg served as Dean of the New School for Social Research from 2013 to 2023 and is chair of the Department of Economics from 1998 to 2001 and 2009 to 2012. William Milberg's research focuses on the relation among globalization, income distribution, and income development, and the history and philosophy of economics. William Milberg teaches a graduate course in international trade and the philosophy of economics. Milberg's undergraduate teaching includes, quote, understanding global capitalism and, quote, business innovation and social justice. William Milberg's course on economics, markets, society, and inequality with Teresa Gelharducci and Paulo dos Santos is posted on Coursera. Milberg is principal investigator for the project titled Beyond Neoliberalism and, quote, Neo-Illiberalism, Economic Policy and Performance for Sustaining Democracy, under grants from the Open Society Foundations and the Hewlett Foundation. William Milberg is also a member of the research team on, quote, monopsony in a global context. Both research projects are based at the Heilbronner Center. William Milberg's most recent work with Deborah Winkler is Outsourcing Economics, Global Value Chains, and Capitalist Development. A previous book, The Crisis of Vision in Modern Economic Thought, was co-authored with the late Robert Heilbronner. His paper with Peter Spiegler, Methodenstreit 2013, Historical Perspectives on the Contemporary Debate over How to Reform Economics, won the award for Best Paper of 2013 in the Forum for Social Economics. William Milberg has consulted a variety of UN organizations, including the UNCTAD, the ILO, and the WTO. William Milberg serves on the editorial boards of the International Review of Applied Economics and the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics and Politics and Solidarity. So that's kind of a long intro of who William Milberg is, but back to the text. If the trail of rationalism ultimately runs into the sands of methodological individualism, what are the course set by Vico and Montesquieu mentioned earlier? By and large, this empiricist path has been followed only by institutionalist economists and the occasional post-Keynesian. But viewed in light of the Durkheim-Maus hypothesis, this should not surprise us. The close link between the concepts of freedom and individualism found in modern social science is a reflection of the worldview of the European bourgeoisie dating from the 12th century, when monetary economy began to expand and the first small towns developed in the interstices of feudal society. Freedom and individualism are flip sides of the same coin. Individualism is the man freed from all bonds, limited only by obligation to respect the freedom of others. The European bourgeoisie sometimes found it necessary to restrict freedom. Absolute monarchy would not have been possible without the support of the Third Estate. But these were passing phases in the struggle against feudalism, so bourgeois ideologues never noticed the contradiction. More important was the need for a conception which separated spiritual and temporal power, giving a real place to the latter and implicitly Giving a real place to... More important was the need for a conception which separated spiritual and temporal power, which giving a real place to the temporal power, and implicitly to reason. The rediscovery of Aristotle in the 13th century brought the concept of man as a political animal, implying that what distinguishes man from animals is their ability to reason. In this vision, which quietly displaced St. Augustine's, the production and distribution of commodities to enrich material life is inferior to the life of contemplation and of public action. Individualism and this concept of freedom were ultimately united in rationalism, which means both freedom from external authority and constraint and freedom of the passions, which link us to the external world. But rationalism also means breaking the bonds of the human community, for where each individual is autonomous, there is no longer room for a whole which transcends the individual. The universe and the community may become external objects, atomized and divided. They may be observed, their, quote, laws may be established, quote, scientifically, but they lose significance for the subject. And the references, that's the end of the piece. The references, there's only 5 of them, or 6 of them, so I'll read them out loud. David Bloor, 1982, Durkheim and Mauss Revisited, Classification and the Sociology of Knowledge, Studies in the History and Philosophy of Science, published in 1982. It's an article. Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss, 1903, Primitive Classification, translated by Rodney Neeham. I want to look up this book. The description of primitive classification by Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss says, Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss maintain that society is the source of the very categories of human thought. First published in the Année Sociologique in 1903, this classic essay has been translated by Rodney Neeham, who also provides a critical introduction. Okay, there's no real description here. Back to the text. William Milberg, 1993 article, Natural Order and Postmodernism in Economic Thought, published in Social Research, volume 60, issue 2. David Ricardo, 1821, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. Adam Smith, 1795, Essays on Philosophical Subjects, published in The Early Writings of Adam Smith, edited by Lindgren in 1967. So before, when I said it was from the Wealth of Nations, I was wrong. And finally, John W.N. Watkins, 1968, Methodological Individualism and Social Tendencies, published in Readings in the Philosophy of Social Sciences, edited by Brodbeck, 269 to 280. Also, John W.N. Watkins, Ideal Types and Historical Explanation, published in The Philosophy of Social Explanation, edited by Ryan. I thought that was an interesting essay. Thank you so much for listening.